Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the people in the room and also those online. My name is, I'm Associate Professor Joanna Tai here at the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning. I am chairing today's seminar and it is my privilege to introduce Professor Margaret Bearman. I was reflecting last night on the topic of the talk and I realised that one of my first research assistant jobs was actually to enter the feedback from 360-degree feedback forms in the medical setting too many years ago now that I wish to disclose. So all of this is to say that Margaret is a dear friend and colleague, and I really look forward to what she's going to share with us today. The format of the session is that she'll talk for maybe 40-45 minutes, as is usual, and then we'll move to questions. There are a number of people online as there are in the room. So if you're online, please use the Q&A function so we can keep track of your questions. If you're in the room, you can pop your hand up like normal. We'll have a microphone to go around. And we will continue until the hour and see what the appetite is for more questions beyond the hour. And at that point, we'll say farewell to anyone who needs to go. And then for those of us in the room afterwards, we will enjoy some afternoon tea. So with no further ado, please welcome Margaret.
Thanks so much, Jo. And if Jo's saying it's too many years ago to mention, it makes me a bit nervous. I suspect Jo might have been a medical student then. So I'm really delighted to talk to you today about this project, which has been something that's really close to my heart. It's about culture, feedback, and looking beyond the individual. But before we do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and also noticing that we're on the border. So the Boonwurrung country is very close, and Boonwurrung country is where I live as well too. So I'd like to pay my respects as well, and to acknowledge elders past, present, and those to come. My agenda. 6 things. I'm going to talk about the feedback problem, but this particular feedback problem, I'm going to talk about a program of research. So, I mean, I don't know what you were anticipating, but I've actually crammed a lot of things into this presentation. Sometimes you need a presentation, you have one thing, one message. That is not the case today. I just, I was too excited. It's about 5 years of research, so it's quite rich, shall we say. Talk about my approach, talk about some things we've learnt, and because we're still now analysing, mulling things over, what we're learning, and I'll make some tentative conclusions. So the feedback problem. There are all sorts of feedback problems, but this is our particular feedback problem. And I think it might look familiar in a lot of domains. So we've been trying to improve feedback in medical training for decades. Around the time when Jo was filling in those forms, we were working on this. We were doing workshops on training people to have better feedback skills. And this feedback, it's been integrated into programmatic assessment systems. Damien's just sitting there. And of course, assessment for learning has become a real part of medical training. And in Canada, coaches are working with trainees on performance. But despite all of this, or I should say, feedback should be wonderful. It should be wonderful. And if you think about higher education, we've been working on it for decades. Surely we should have gotten there by now. But how am I doing? Very simple question. Feedback should be able to answer it. It kind of doesn't. There are still problems. I've done a lot of work specifically in medical specialty training, but also in higher education over the years, and people really struggle to know how they're performing and what they might need to do to improve. It happens on a so frequent basis. And then also you get things like this. Study of general practice. They're talking about some of the things, and this is a mild case of the sort of commentary that we got. Suck it up, basically, or get out. And that wasn't very helpful. We see a lot of this. And as I said, this is mild. I don't want to tell you about well, I will tell you about it because I started. But there's the story of the poor trainee who was so feedback poor that they went to their medical insurer to help them with their performance practice issue rather than their supervisor, because they were in a remote rural situation and their supervisor was really not being helpful. So there's a challenge, and it's a long-standing challenge. And so we were kind of mulling this over, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and we've had some feedback presentations earlier, and it's sort of coming around this point. Everyone says, well, we can teach feedback skills to educators, and now we've got feedback literacy skills that we teach to students. They just need to, that if we help them look and find and gather the feedback, things will get better. But I think my feeling is there's more than this. And I think that one of the things that I'm really coming to is, and I think we've known when we started this project, is feedback's not always the same thing. So I was really influenced by this study of Chris Watling that compares music, people who are training to be musicians, to be sports people, and to do medicine. And feedback in those circumstances looks very, very, very different. I mean, if you can think of all the tasks that you've done outside of the academy, maybe you've played a sport, or you've learnt a skill, or something along those sorts of lines, and you think about how different feedback is. Something physical, that's quite a different way of doing feedback. In music, for example, everyone knew what the performance was, and they're sort of iterative over and over. No one was frightened of being critical. Everyone just went on and on. In ballet, being critical is a sign that you're doing something good. And if someone isn't critical, it's a sign you're not going very well. So all sorts of cultural reads. So this really led us to the idea that maybe we should attend more to the culture. So this led to a program of research, a very exciting program of research, 5 years. And it really revolves, even though these aren't the research questions we started with, these are sort of, I think, the things that are interesting that come out of it. What's the role of culture with respect to feedback and surgical and intensive care medicine training? They're the situations we're in. But then also, how do we think about feedback practices to account for culture? And then finally, and I think, again, this is a question we all want to know, how do you change a culture? Because that's actually, I think people make a lot of noises, oh, we need culture change. But actually, if we knew how to change cultures, if you've spent any time looking at healthcare research, you'd know that half the disasters in hospitals wouldn't happen, because they're almost often people go down the root cause analysis. Well, there was a problem with the culture. So how do we change it? Small questions. So I'm going to tell you a bit about specialty training in healthcare. There are a couple of people, my colleague Damien, who's on this team here, is an anaesthetist, so we've got folk here and possibly online who work in this arena, but for most people, it's a little bit of a mystery. The main thing, having worked in this field for a while, that I can't get over is how long it is. It just goes on forever. You finish medical school and then you do some stuff floating around a hospital, and then you get accepted into a training program that's highly competitive, and then you spend 5 or 6 years working really hard. And people often don't realise, who are out of healthcare, but a lot of the care you get in a public hospital is delivered by trainees. They're people in these training programs who are being supervised by consultants. So it is absolute environment of learning through work, working and learning at the same time, also doing exams, also doing other forms of work-based assessment. Trainee surgeons are enrolled with the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, RACS, and training intensivists are enrolled, they may not even use the word enrolled, with the College of Intensive Care Medicine, KICM, or something, might have another acronym. And I'd like to say that from my perspective, it's a perfect environment to study feedback cultures, because as I've said, I gave you an illustration from general practice. Feedback can be super problematic in these environments, and it feels like we've hit a ceiling. And for those who aren't in this environment, that ceiling may feel a little familiar. really reliant on feedback not being in the hand of people who know a lot about feedback, unlike us who are here at this seminar because we're interested and we care. They're really context-heavy environments. I mean, all environments have a lot of context, but the blend between working and training plays a strong role. So people are not just there to learn, they're working. And so they're really embedded in very clear day-to-day practices. And then we can compare across these similar but different contexts to see the role of local variation. And, a note to our sponsors who were incredibly generous. We're funded by RACS and College of Intensive Care Medicine. Wonderful to work with these colleges, and I really hope that the work has been useful to them. We've been giving them reports along the way. And also shout out to Ready, which gave a seeding grant at the very start of this to get us going. Current and past team members, huge shout out, it's a biggish team. Liz Malloy, Charlotte and Robin, all from the University of Melbourne. Chris Watling, whose work we referred to, who's in Canada, as is Roller now in Canada, left us. Jo Hilda, who I saw online, Paige Marnie, who's floating around here somewhere. Oh, there she is. Nicole Crawford, also online. Julian Archer, who's at Griffith University now, and Nat Ward. And Damien, of course, who I mentioned before. We've had a couple of pubs out. I'm not really going to make much reference to them. They're really just there to show that, we've been productive and bona fide. You can catch up with them later. Or not. So this is the approach. First of all, a tricky question. What do we mean by culture? Culture is a really annoying thing to define. More definitions that you can shake a stick at. So we took the approach of using practice theory. So we just said that culture is a matter of practices, what people do, and sort of these more than what people do, but the routine things that people do. Like doing a seminar is academic business. I stand up here, you look at the slides that I present, you'll sit down and listen. You know the form. That's a practice. And that takes place in social and material arrangements. The speaker sits up here, they have certain roles, but also you're in this particular place with these particular chairs, these particular tables. And this sort of frame allows us to account for culture in a lot of different ways. And I just want to mention, because this question is asked when I do this talk, you can think about culture as institutional. What's it like at Deakin University or this hospital? You can think about culture in terms of, in this instance, specialty training, surgery or intensive care medicine. Or you can think about culture as a national thing, Australian versus Indian versus whatever. So we came into this agnostic as to which culture mattered. We weren't sure. And we had a lot of people who'd worked across national culture. Sorry, I'm moving the mic a little bit. National cultures, and we certainly had people working across institutional cultures. But the one thing that really mattered, in my view, and the analysis of the data suggested, was the specialty culture. What people did, the fact that they were surgeons or intensivists mattered more than the hospital they were at and more than the country that they practiced in. So that's culture. I think feedback's probably even trickier, but we'll go there. This is the sociocultural definition of feedback. So a dynamic and emergent process accomplished through social encounters between students, teachers, and relevant resources. And it's characterised by students making meaning of and acting upon knowledge about the quality of their performance and what they can do to improve it. Sorry, no, I thought I was booming before. Is that better now? Perfect. So keep me on track if I go off again. Beautiful. So you missed my definition of feedback, which is fine because it will be contested by someone somewhere. We were particularly interested in conversations. So we weren't saying feedback was just conversations, but we were doing this work because we'd been commissioned to, well, not we'd been commissioned, we were in partnership with RACS and KIC, and we're really interested in what supervisors can do. And what they can do is have conversations. So really sensitized to the role of conversations. And we didn't regard them as the only source of feedback or the only contributor to meaning making. And in fact, to be honest, I don't know how much they featured in that contribution to meaning making. So this is a whole caboodle, 3 phases: interviews and ethnography. I would like to point out that this ethnography took place mostly during COVID, and we are probably one place in the world where you could get into intensive care. Not here, study spanned Australia, so it wasn't here in Victoria, very few places. And then finally, the 3rd phase, which is a series of participatory workshops and iterative pieces. I'm not going to go into any more methods except for the last piece, other more than that. What we learnt. Feedback really was taking place on 2 planes. There was task level feedback. How well have I done this? How can I improve it? And that was relatively plentiful in various forms. Maybe not always feedback conversations, but there was some way of accessing that. Then there were conversations or feedback about overall progression. On the road to becoming a surgeon or an intensivist, how well have I done and how can I improve? So both evaluative, but one was quite local and one was sort of bigger level. Specialty feedback cultures really diverged at the task level enormously. And it was remarkable how different they were. I was actually really shocked by this. So in surgery, it's really common to have co-location with consultants. The people who directly supervise you are often in the room with you. They're watching you do the surgery, and sometimes when you're not doing it very well, taking it over. Focus on operative skills. And in the subspecialties we looked at, it was easy to interpret cues from the patient's bodies about their progress, or relatively easy. Feedback conversations about operative skills tended to happen very frequently, and there was a shared understanding about what good operative quality performance looked like. There were some problems in surgery as well too. If it was outside of the operative setting, feedback quality just sort of dropped away entirely, and there were places where it didn't seem to go at all. So, for example, a trainee surgeon has to go down and negotiate with all the other registrars at some point to, move patients around beds. That was like a feedback devoid zone. No one saw those conversations and no one really knew how to improve them either. But this is the sort of thing people said. When I'm closing skin, I look at the clock and see how long it takes me. If the wound comes together nicely, if it looks right, I see. That's how I look at my progress. That's a nice, certain world, don't you think? And then there's intensive care medicine. Often, but not always, minimal co-location with consultants because people needed to work. So the hospitals needed to be staffed and the senior trainees needed to fill in for that staffing. And the junior trainees were often with the senior ones, but the senior ones were rarely with the consultants. So supervision tended to be handover first thing in the morning, or this moment of handover you'd hear about. You'd have a moment to discuss what was going on. There's a tendency towards tacit validation. That sounds bad, but it was actually a really lovely practice. So it was quite difficult, intensive care medicine. It's quite stressful, it seems to be. So there was lots of coffee buying and buying biscuits and, sitting down and having chats. And there was almost no cue from the patient's body or the patients about their progress. And this is, again, sort of really interesting to me. So in surgery, if the patients would say, "Thank you, really appreciate you, doctor," the trainee surgeons would go, "Well, great." What would they know? In intensive care medicine, that's very nice, but they don't know about surgery. Intensive care medicine, when trainees got letters, and sometimes people wrote them things long afterwards about how their care had been, it could move them to tears because they hadn't had any commentary on what it was like. And there's some really, I don't think we published this data, but this beautiful sort of conversation about where a trainee intensivist said, I got this letter from a guy who was really difficult. He was angry. He didn't want to be there. But then 6 weeks after we let him out, he wrote me this really long letter saying how confused and dazed and difficult it was to be in intensive care and how grateful he was and how good the care was. And that made a huge difference to that trainee. So you see these sorts of big differences. Feedback conversations with consultants happened much more rarely. And both supervisors and trainees struggled to articulate what quality of performance looked like. What does good intensive care look like? We kept on asking people over and over again. It was very difficult to pin down. And this is the sort of things people said. In intensive care medicine, you are making decisions where you're making what you think is the best decision. You won't see the outcome for a long time. And even if the outcome's good, it doesn't necessarily mean your decision was right. It may be that random things have conspired and they've gone well, or they might die, the patient might die, or they might have a really bad outcome and you might have done everything right. So there's real confusion about this. And it's interesting, in my view, I suspect there are points like this in surgery as well too. They just weren't as attuned to it. They weren't as interested in it. But outside of this task level, there was more convergence. And I put in question marks here a medical culture of feedback. So this is what we saw in medicine. And I wonder, the trainees were highly feedback literate. Like we talk about teaching people the skills to do feedback. These trainees went out of their way to orchestrate getting information on their performance. They orchestrated situations to get it from consultants. They would ask physiotherapists to help them, bag a patient. They would look, in theatre, they would look at the nurses. Not everyone, but in general, highly feedback literate, constantly seeking it. There was an absolute culture of silence about emotions. I found this really interesting because everyone, we published about this, everyone was kind of talking about emotions the whole time. Like, you must be, you must be less aggressive, you must be more empathetic, whatever it was they were saying. Yet they didn't really talk about the emotional load at all. And if you're in intensive care, it's probably more than surgery, but in both situations, they were highly charged environments. And they were really mindful that those junior wouldn't understand, the intern coming into surgery who's doing seeing an amputation for the first time, freaked out. But yet that freaking out wasn't talked about, even though it was noted. So it was absolute silence on this front. There was an absolutely limited meaningful conversations about overall progress. They had the conversations. That's what formal feedback was for. They would have these rotations where you'd sit down and have the conversation. But they were very performative, and but not, I think, even so much by the supervisors. The supervisors would say things like, "We think you're great, you're going really well," and the trainees would kind of just disregard it. "Oh, I don't think that's the case." So it was kind of like they were talking past each other. And what we saw was trainees spent a lot of time patching together incomplete progress information for themselves. Because in these conversations about progress, I don't think the information about performance really entered in that much. They really had trouble with these concrete examples. So what really happened? How do you know how you're going? Trainees sat down and went, "Well, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this, and I'm going to put together a picture." So people talk about the pixel analogy, and this is exactly what we saw. The trainees would say, "Oh, my logbook says I'm doing this." And they get a bit more information. And then they get a bit more information. And they kind of go, "Yeah, I think I can see where I'm going." And then that would be about as good as it got. I don't know if you know what animal that is. That is a cow. It could be a dog, or it could be a sculpture, and you wouldn't know, right? It's the mountains as well. And I think it really reminded us of the ways assessors talk about working out whether a trainee is competent or not. And I think this is one of the big lessons for me from this part of the study, is that we talk about feedback and we talk about performance as if there is an answer, but sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the more information you get is not going to give you answer the question you have. How do we know what competence is? Well, it may not be a black and white issue, and we kind of act, I think, in higher ed particularly, as if it is. And in this situation was completely marked. There was kind of an intensive care, and sometimes in surgery as well, there was just kind of not really a way of knowing whether someone was at standard or not. And so the feedback was necessarily going to be best guess, patchy, difficult. a matter of meaning making rather than concrete conclusions. And it made me really think that we could pay more attention to the tentative nature here of feedback. So that's kind of what we learned. I told you I'm going through a lot. Do you want to pause, take a breath? All right, you're good. Okay, you're good.
You're on a roll.
I'm on a roll. I'm rolling. Excellent. So that's what we learned, and that stuff has mostly been published, and those are the papers. And I mean, I really am also interested in stuff on the emotions, but that's another piece. Then we're in this last phase, and we're in the middle of it analysing this. And this phase seems so easy when we put it down on paper. But as Phil was alluding to earlier in our talks, sometimes getting participants to participate is a real lot of work. So we did workshops with trainees and consultants from both surgery and intensive care, from several healthcare systems, muddled them all in together and asked them to talk about feedback strategies based on this data, saying, you know, we've seen a lot of things aren't clear. Let's talk about what some of them might be. And we did 2 sets of those. One set, then we drew stuff together, then another set when we went back. And then out of that, we came up with this sort of tentative map of strategies. Then out of those strategies, we worked with 6 participants, 3 trainees, 3 consultants, to talk about putting these strategies into practice. We worked with them for periods of about, I don't know, up to, you know, a month to like 3 or 4 months, just trialing things over and over again. Try this, how is it working? Try that, how's it working? Because these were the problems in feedback that we could see we didn't know the answers to, and we didn't know how it was going to play out in their culture and their context. So we're just getting them to try things on for size. And then at the end of all of that, we put together a series. We drew from all 5 years worth of data collection to put together strategies. And the strategies, there's 6 strategies. We did them for trainees and consultants, surgical culture, ICM culture, and for consultants, we did advanced and simple. And I have found this to be one of the more fascinating pieces. I learnt a lot in this. I mean, it just really struck me again that we just don't come to questions of feedback neutral. You know, here in the institution, we hold our expertise and say, I know about feedback. And it's true. I remember I've really learnt a lot from learning about feedback. I think I'm work better with it now than I did beforehand. But working with this range of folk and hearing them and what they brought, I really realised that there's kind of like, you really have to take account of what people think and believe, because they're not going to listen to you simply because you say, this is my view. And they're working in a particular situation that is so far away from where I am. And that, if you think of all those levels of culture, you know, whether it be institutional, whether it be the particular department that you're in, whether it be the discipline, the specialty, you know, the state, everything nests. So to me, sort of one of the things I really learned about this from this project was my own openness to alternatives and to perhaps be a little less dogmatic about what I thought feedback was, even though, of course, secretly I am dogmatic, but I try not to be. And then out of all of this, we put together practical one-pagers. We did get to be a bit dogmatic here. And we privileged the strategies that our 6 participants trialled and found helpful, or that people really reported using and that worked. Because I've had a lot of strategies that are principle-based, and sometimes they founder on the shore of reality. You know, there is no time to talk to anyone, etc., etc. So I'm just going to run through a few of these, really 3 sample ones, to give you a sense of where we landed. This is for intensive care medicine trainees. And there's a similar one for surgeons, but looks a little bit different, because we start with this first statement, which is absolutely true. These trainees find it very difficult to get information about their performance for all the reasons I've stated beforehand. And so they need to even start by asking if there are things to focus on for improvement. They can ask it of their supervisors, they can ask it of their peers, they can ask it of their sort of more seniors, they can ask it from the nurses, from the physiotherapists. This next one was really important. Don't expect feedback to always work. It really doesn't. Sometimes you get information and it's not useful to you in the here and now. And also, this one is a little bit more expected. Don't expect useful feedback to always feel comfortable. There often was a lot of discomfort involved. This is an example from surgical supervisors. Now, I raise this because in surgery in particular, we taught a lot of models. I've been involved in teaching models. And what we really found was people struggled with models, but they were simultaneously useful. So we really practiced, or I sort of worked with my person. I think people worked with their other trainee, with their, when they're in this sort of longitudinal relationship about opening up conversations. How do you open up a conversation? And some people found fallback phrases. Most people had a fallback phrase that they found helpful. Sometimes they use those structured models, but sometimes they just have one in their back pocket. How do you think you went? Or if you had another go, what would you do differently? But just having that phrasing there to help you going was really useful. And this trying out of phrases was also really helpful. And this next point, a little bit like feedback doesn't always work, I think in almost all of our longitudinal conversations, people had strategies that didn't work in the first time they tried it. They really didn't work at all. And then they sort of kind of did. But when they were working, it seemed to me, at any rate, that they stopped realizing that they were strategies and they just become part of what they do on an everyday basis. So it's kind of this weird movement where they had to persist, but then once they'd persisted, they didn't really see it as a triumph. It was just something that was part of the landscape. Here's another one. And I think this one was really important. I think it was in all four domains: consultants, trainees, ICM, and surgery. Seek and be a feedback role model. Because remember, these trainees are also teaching at the same time. They're teaching and they're giving in the feedback expert position. So they all had something that looked like this. Observe someone who does feedback well. In an ICU, it's very difficult to observe someone else because you're not located with each other. So it might be outside. And often try on for size and look at their techniques. Try and see what you think good feedback looks like. And if you feel comfortable, demonstrate to trainees and colleagues how to learn from feedback by seeking out and responding to comments about your performance in a group situation. So I remember there was a surgical leader who said, I hate doing this, but I do it every time to show that we have a unit that values feedback. I ask for comments, and boy, people aren't quiet in telling me what they think about my performance. I mean, and I have to respond to it and I have to be open to it. So again, back to my point about that humility in going in towards listening to the participants, it seems that a bit of openness and humility goes a long way in all situations here. And that everyone felt that this could help build a culture of feedback. And in fact, the trainees really wanted to do this because they wanted to build a culture of feedback. And by a culture of feedback, they meant a situation where getting information about performance was seen as not something was uncomfortable or difficult or that needed to be chased, but something was taken for granted as something that could work with generosity and all those things, that we associate with feedback that is effective in a workplace. So now I can pause for a moment. You can get some resources. There's 6 of them. There's a QR code. I'll write a blog post and launch them. And what I'd ask you to do at look is at these resources. A lot of you aren't. In fact, I can't see anyone who is a surgeon or an intensivist in the room. But have a look at the 6 of them and compare them. So we have different adjustments to different environments. One's for trainees, people who are seeking to you find feedback, people who are in the place of feedback receiving, and we had simple and advanced in consultants. Because the other thing we found here, and I think it's really important to mention, is that, gosh, it's difficult. We ask clinicians, these are working folk, they're doing a lot, they're very, very busy people talking about participants. I can't tell you how busy people are and how much, I have not done a feedback workshop where people gone, oh my goodness, 6, and people from New Zealand, 11 p.m. on a Friday night is when I want to run my 2-hour feedback workshop. But we had it with these people because that's the time they could find, and that's the dedication they give. They are slightly, I warn you, if you do go into hospital, sorry, if you're listening online and you're clinicians, people are slightly crazed. They do things like run ultra marathons, Damien, and they really work harder than you can possibly imagine. So this is like people really dedicated in this space. And we're asking these dedicated, hardworking, opinionated folk to stop what they're doing and pick up these really difficult skills that involve them putting their egos to one side, trying new ways of doing, and things that are really complicated. We've got to ask ourselves what we can realistically ask. And certainly, I really took away from this that sometimes we ask too much of people. And we need to really attend to where people are coming from, not where we want them to be. Not to say things can't improve, but I think that maybe that meeting is more important than perhaps we've given credence to. So here's some tentative conclusions for you. These are the questions, if you recall, I asked. What's the role of culture with respect to these two specialties in specialty feedback cultures? Well, the tasks, the spaces, and the availability of supervisors, I think, really shaped specialty feedback cultures, particularly the patient outcomes played a much stronger role than I ever would have anticipated going into this. It seems so obvious to us now, but it didn't seem obvious going in. The uncertainty of tasks seems to be really important, and I think that's really a worthwhile thing to think about, even within, and we come to this later, feedback cultures. But I think it also means that we tend to gravitate to the things that are certain. And we see this in surgery, where it's easy to be concrete, we're going to be concrete, yet maybe that may not be the thing that matters most. And we also need to think about how we manage this complex question of how am I going? And I think it's worth thinking about in any culture, some tasks or topics are privileged or avoided. We could see that in surgery, everyone wanted to focus on operative skills. In ICM, no one wanted to talk about emotions, even though patients and families, I mean, it's the most emotional. If you've ever had, been in an intensive care environment, I've certainly been with my family. It is the most emotional environment ever. And yet no one is talking about it. So there are things, and there may be reasons for that, but it might be worth considering why. Why are we focusing on this and not on that? Because one thing about culture is when you're swimming in it, you can't see it. So this comes to a little bit of what I've just mentioned. It's kind of like the broader zoom out of this. I think for me, a huge lesson was meeting people and culture where they're at, not where you want them to be. I mean, I know that I have learnt over the years, being in this game a long time, I've learnt to do things really well, but I've practiced a lot and I've studied a lot. And it's easy to forget that people don't have the advantages of that. And sometimes we need to do very simple things. And the other thing was, people just really came in with very strong opinions and they weren't going to relinquish them. It didn't matter what I said. They had their way of doing things and that was it. And I think that would be familiar to us in academia as well. And, maybe we need to be like water, flow around rather than try and change. I think that cultures have ways of knowing how well people are performing. This comes to the idea of certainty. Some, and I see it in almost every discipline I see taught in, there are different degrees of certainty. Sometimes people know really well how they're going. How do conversations supplement in those views? They might be quite different. But when things are uncertain, a conversation might hold a different role. So it's about thinking about, what I suppose Quinlan and Pitt would call consequential feedback, although that line is incredibly muddied in this world. But you might want to think about how conversation runs in around the information you already have, and to, focus on those things that aren't talk about and wonder why. And then finally, the last piece was how to change feedback cultures. And this, I thought there are two things that were really useful. One is to dial back on the expectation that feedback or a feedback strategy will necessarily work for a particular person in a particular place. Sometimes it's just not that useful, but also the other thing about feedback is it is relational. It's me relying on you, whether I'm seeking it as a trainee, whether I'm in the position of expertise. And you can't make that other person be what you want them or need them to be. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes the trainees could not get their consultants to speak to them. They weren't around, they weren't available, they were too busy, nothing they could do. That's okay. You have to work within that. And sometimes supervisors, trainees had other things on their mind. I can't, again, stress how and busy these folk were. And we see that within higher education, our students as well. People have lives, they have caring responsibilities, they're awfully juggling. I mean, I can't, these training surgical, the registrars were working 12-hour days, they were juggling all sorts of things, they were studying as well. Sometimes they just didn't have the headspace. And then I thought this final point was really music to my ears, because this is something that I've sort of hypothesized a lot, but it was really nice to see it come out in data, that modeling feedback and openness to learning appeared to work in terms of building a culture of feedback. Like that was something that really made a difference. I don't know whether it changed the specialty culture of feedback, but in terms of departmental, in terms of the local culture, that seemed to be an important push. So that's all I have for you. I'll leave you with, the ideal beauty that we'll never achieve to answer your questions as best I can.
All right. We're testing something different today. The person who's managing the online Q&A is indeed online as well. That's Jack. But are there any questions in the room first? Wow. Yes. Now, I'm going to give this to Phil.
Thanks so much, Margaret. It's wonderful to hear like the long form version of what's been corridor conversations over such a length of time. You and I have interesting chats about feedback literacy and our different views on it. And you poo-pooed it a little bit at the start, which is okay.
I said more than.
I'm going to just try and get at something. So the strategies sounded a bit like feedback literacy, some of them.
Yes.
And I'm trying to pick up this. And I think it feels like the nuance is that the strategies are directed not at the capability, but at the cultural and the relational.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key difference is that feedback literacy, I think, takes as read that it's something that you have to hold. Well, these strategies, if you move or you shift, may change. And there's something a little less constant about them. There is overlap, but at the end of the day, and this is why I it started with what if there was more than. You also have to remember that was feedback literacy 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think feedback literacy, as we heard in the Turkan's conversation, is starting to take more account of context and so forth. But I think this strategy business is where I've landed with it. I think Liz Malloy uses the term feedback know-how, and I like that term very much. It sees for literacy, and then the strategies are specific strands within it. That you might tie. And I think the thing is they're also very unideal. Like they try and take account of the things that aren't possible rather than things that are. That's probably my best example. But I don't mean to poo-poo feedback literacy entirely. What I want to say is that my concern that I'm seeing less of these days is that feedback literacy becomes, well, you go forth and find it, and I can just keep on doing exactly what I've always done. That's probably my major concern, and I'm sure you'd share that as well too.
I think all that you've said is an entirely fair critique of it. Yeah, thank you so much.
You can say it's not fair, Phil. We've had robust conversations.
No, I'm reminded of many long chats in this space about, and I think part of it's the view of the location of the problem, as you state there, that feedback literacy sometimes locates the problem in the individual, and as you've described, it doesn't sound like it's the individuals who've got problems here.
Yeah, exactly.
Laura, I'm gonna go one more in the room, but Jack, if you could prepare an online question for the next question, please.
Thanks. Thank you for a beautiful presentation, Margaret. That was fascinating. So interesting to see the culture play out so strongly, and it makes perfect sense when you know that culture of medicine and there's huge differences between those disciplines. How do we then learn from that, though, when it's a student who needs to work across multiple cultures? And I know, a medical student, for example, we send them to surgery, and we send them to intensive care, and we send them to general practice. And similarly, I suppose a student doing other workplace learning placement type activities across a completely different context will need to work and learn and be assessed in different cultures. How can we support students to navigate that?
Yeah, I have an answer for you, which is might be surprising, but I think students are a little bit held from the culture because of their status as students. And you'll often find that you wouldn't get a student spoken to, occasionally you do, but the trainees have it harder in a way in that cultural bound. So there are privileges about being a student which allow them to negotiate some of it. So I think the advice I would give is to lean into that. You can ask a really, for want of a better word, naive, dumb, or possibly one might just say intelligent, because you don't, or how could you know any better, question as a student. And that affords you certain things. So in some ways, I think people are really willing to offer information to students in a way they're not going to with other folk. Because one of the big features in all these environments, and I think this is true across medicine, and I think Liz Malloy and Christie's work on this has come a little bit, is that what I think really interferes with everyone is they're really just so super busy. They're insanely busy. So the eye roll that comes because you're slowing me down is, I think, probably common to everything. So I think that some of those, and to point at Phil, those feedback literacy strategies of trying to get information without annoying people are probably the most important piece of work in those sort of health workplace settings, because I think that busyness is a key feature. But I think talking about emotions would not be a bad thing at medical student level as well too, because it's just not talked about.
Jack.
Are you ready for the voice from above?
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
What a wonderful reaction. That was great. Margaret, I can see you just sort of looking up.
I'm having for you, Jack.
For those playing along, this is, I think, the first time we've ever tried this. I'm going to start with the questions in order of most upvotes. So for those online, if you want to vote for questions, please do so. It'll help us to sort through them in the time that we've got. I'm going to start with a question from Anne Parkinson, who asks, is feedback culture different in the medical field because of the personalities of the individuals involved? For example, high functioning, long training periods, and so on. How would it compare, say, to perhaps feedback given to an apprentice electrician by their supervisor? Not picking out electricians specifically, just as an example there. And Silas Taylor has chimed in, wondering if the team considered different specialties within medicine and how did the chosen specialists become chosen? Given surgeons and intensivists are a particular type, Silas is speaking from experience. GPs, geriatricians might have different perspectives. So wondering what you might say to that.
Okay, I'm going to answer the second one first. So I've worked a lot in general practice as well, and I actually thought general practice and intensive care medicine, even though one's community-based and hospital-based, had a lot more in common than you would think because of the uncertainty of the patient outcome. It was striking how more similar they were actually, which goes a little bit to the question, the first question that was asked. I think our overriding impression, you know, these are small qualitative studies, impression was that the practice mattered the most. Sure, personalities mattered because, you know, that is part of a culture that, but the actual task at hand really seemed to influence the feedback given. So the uncertain, unended nature in general practice and intensive care medicine meant that they seemed a lot more similar in a lot of qualities than the two hospital-based specialties. And I think that there's literature to show as well too, and I think so. This is a question for probably electricians as well. Is I bet that anything that is you know, that is certain and psychomotor probably is easier around the feedback sort of mode. And when the electricians come to dealing with the difficult clients or etc., things might get a little bit hairy as well too. But for sure, we haven't done that study, but I was really surprised in that comparison as to how different specialties that you thought would be more similar were and why they were selected. Sponsorship arrangements. No, the reality is we did this work for RACS and the College of Intensive Care Medicine, so that's why. But I have worked in other specialties. I would love to consider other situations as well. More voice from above, or
We can go another voice from above since we had two in the room.
Okay, and now I'm watching the upvotes clock up. The next most voted question is also from Silas Taylor, but it's a bit different. Silas has asked, what effect do you think power has in the feedback culture you observed? And a question mark here, perhaps Bourdieu's perspective might be useful or helpful. What do you think?
Well, power is one of the reasons we're here in many ways. So one of the big things, and I haven't talked about this, but and I'm gesturing at Damien, who's on the team, who did his thesis on basically on power and when he's about power and so forth, in assessment for learning. Power is huge and it runs through the entire culture. It's a hierarchical culture. One of the things, and you can talk about learning the rules of the game and all that kind of stuff. So it's there, it's everywhere. But one of the things that I think that this work does is it doesn't, I mean, I think Bourdieu himself, I don't know, I had a big argument about Bourdieu recently and I was so wrong. So I'm mindful of not claiming too much expertise here. But in the work I've read, at any rate, I would not be making the claim that this is something that you can change. So we do have hierarchies, we do have power, and it is part, I would say, bundled in with the practice. So we have to do feedback in and around and working with it. And that's really, I think, where I'm interested in this work. I mean, you know, it's also very difficult, sort of like running on from that point and meeting people where they're at, for people in positions of power, and we saw this with our supervisors, to remember what it was like not to have any power. So they really were so good-hearted. They really thought that they could anticipate what the trainees were doing and feeling, but they really just forgotten, and particularly further out they were, forgotten what it was like to be reliant on someone else for that tick of approval, for that job, for that security, and it really affected how they were. So yes, it ran through everything, but I don't know how helpful a frame it is when it comes to change. Dave.
Yeah, I was interested in that you were talking about two kind of occasions of feedback. One is on tasks.
Yes.
And one was the overall development.
Yes.
I wondered if in the project you had any opportunity to look at the successes of the system. By that I mean people that have gone through and thrived. Do they have any awareness whatsoever of feedback in their own development? And how do they account for it?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that in a complicated way. I think that a lot of people we're speaking to were thriving. There were a couple who weren't. The ones who were thriving, and this talks a little bit what Laura was speaking about. They sort of fit in with the system, and feedback. They managed to make feedback work for them. Despite it, not because of it. So when they were trainees, they worked really hard to gather it, and so on. Sometimes people had productive people are very contradictory in this space. So sorry, folk, if anyone here who's listening who was a participant. And I think it's fairly natural, and you could see it even when I was talking. So when you got something, you thrived, you often forgot about it. So people would have productive uses of feedback and it would work and they'd be very happy with it. And they kind of say, but I haven't had meaningful conversations. What I think we found was that the task-based stuff was often identified as good and useful. But in the patching together situation, there wasn't a lot. And I think that's because, for two reasons. One is I suspect that it's a matter for someone to come to themselves. So that in fact, feedback itself, the role of the person is actually facilitatory rather than telling. This is all the information. How do you patch together? What do you think? Because it's something you come to in yourself. And I think that really comes to when you define feedback, as we did, as meaning making, in the end, it rests with you, the person doing it. So we had examples of really nice conversations, but honestly, people could thrive without them. So they weren't, but what I think you could get from it, the moments of thriving that I saw were those open conversations where people stood up in front of the group and said, now I'm going to show it, now I'm going to model it, and how difficult that was, that how much permission they felt that either as seers or doers that gave people. I think for me, that was a standout moment. So that's kind of a kind of yeah, nah, not maybe, but around and about. So yeah.
Thanks.
But there was a decoupling, I think, of thriving and effective feedback. Some people going to thrive irrespective. And they just went, right, I'm in a bad situation. This is me talking about all the data sets I've done and over the years. Heads down, tails up. This is a bad rotation. It's going to be awful. I'm just going to get through.
I'm aware but there's probably, there's 0 seconds left in the hour. So thanks for anyone who needs to head off at this point in time. And thanks, Paige, for doing the online version of that already. This is the last seminar in the series for this year. So thanks. Have a safe and happy end of year festive period. And we hope to see you next year. I think there's definitely one question in the room. Phil, if you could put the mic over, and there's probably a few more online, but we'll go in the room first.
Thanks, Margaret, for a lovely presentation and so interesting. I'm wondering where to from now with this. How are the colleges going to use this so that there is actually some impact, some translation? And have you been able to shape their agenda and how this might influence practice going forward?
This has happened over some phases, and I think the earliest phases did have, I don't know, I think Jackie and the surgeons might be online. I think it did have real input into some of their approaches, so the earlier phases, so what we've learned. The resources, I'm not sure how it's going to be used in a more structured sense, but I am very aware that we need to have an ongoing conversation, and we were waiting till after this seminar to probably have that conversation. And Jackie, if you're online, that's to you. So what, and the colleges are not the same as well. I also need to point this out. So College of Intensive Care Medicine is really small, and all the training program is the same. The College of the Surgeons is like an umbrella for about, I don't know how many, 10, 12, maybe I'm oversighting it, subspecialties. So they also have different modes. So actually what we did may not be very useful to trauma surgery, because that's a really uncertain, unlike the sort of scheduled surgeries that we were observing and working with. So the answer is an ongoing space. I think that what I learnt the most from was that those conversations that we had, that rather than doing a workshop and walking away and that's done, probably the most useful thing was actually iterating and touching in with people over time. And that seemed to make an enormous amount of difference. So I think for our participants that we worked with, a couple of them I thought really had absolute changes in practice. And my interest would be to see, I hate that word scale up, but if there's any possibility to expand that to something that might be done with peers or more locally.
Jack, is there another online question? Voice from above.
A few more online questions, but I'm going to go to one from Matt Brett, who says, thanks, Margaret, fantastic presentation. Wondering if you have any thoughts on the multiplicity of feedback loops that intensivists/surgeons may be exposed to, including feedback from consultants or supervisors, healthcare teams, patients, patient families, and so on. And particularly how feedback from end users is triangulated with expert feedback.
I think, as I alluded to, I think surgeons and intensivists did manage that somewhat differently. So surgeons kind of had the view that patients had a very limited range of expertise, certainly not around operative skills, but they could be very thoughtful about patient communication. That would be where it was. But in general, I think we saw that. Again, this is a small study, that generally I think it was less privileged. In ICM, where there's so little information from anyone, it was really valued. So a really different sort of experience. And it comes to a little bit about how you define quality of performance. And I think, for a surgeon, a job really well done will be a surgery that doesn't need redoing. I mean, I hate talking in medical terms because it's not my actual area, but there's stuff, it doesn't leak, people don't come back, doesn't need redoing. Davian's laughing at me. And then in ICM, it's kind of, when you ask people what's a good day, well, I think it's more that people might feel that their needs were attended to. And we also heard in ICM as well, I do recall this sort of a little bit to the point that sometimes patient care and trainee care were in actual opposition. So they talk about how a consultant would go in and do a family meeting with people who are bereaved, and it's really difficult. And then they basically use up all their emotional muscle and then come out and be quite drained and short and tired and unable to deal with trainees. So, lots of complexity there.
Any other in there? You, sir. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Margaret. Absolutely wonderful work. I would have a question related to the idea of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And as someone not in the health professions area at all, that was my key takeaway. This idea that so often we use feedback to control and manage things in higher education. We want students to learn certain things and we want to help and support them, and we design feedback for them in particular ways, and then we measure whether feedback was efficient in the ways that we want to measure it in. But now you're saying that there are these uncertain elements in there, and feedback actually plays a huge part in there. So I'd just like to follow up from there. Given that you've done quite a bit of work in the assessment and feedback design area yourself, what did you learn about the idea of feedback design based on this project? Now that you taught us all about this taught us about these elements of uncertainty that are so important to consider in feedback?
So the big thing that I would bring into account, and this goes onto a whole lot of work that we've done on evaluative judgment, goes to assessment as well too, is this idea of, and I'm trying to think of a different word because every time we tried this with the in our participatory and they hated it or they didn't pick it up, which is this idea of patching together information. So what I've learned is that this idea of bringing together these meaning making through patching together information, and and you are the self-assessment person, Yuso. So that act of self-assessment, that act of bringing together pieces of information about performance that may not stitch together a complete picture, but that might give you some inferences about where to go, is a really useful skill. Particularly because, in my view, in higher education and in medicine and, to be honest, in life, we want to be able to do the complex, uncertain, difficult things. They're the things where the problems reside. That's what we can help our students with the most. So that's what I've learned.
Oh, and patching up these different things into a nice little I don't know, one thing might be like an act of self-reflection or self-assessment in itself.
Exactly. And facilitated by someone, and that may be the role of feedback.
Okay, I think there's one more question online, Jack.
Well, there's actually 3, but
Okay.
we can. I'll be guided by you, Joe.
Just one more.
This question comes from Amina. Margaret, how did the tentative findings here make you feel about the future of feedback in these contexts?
So it's an interesting space to feel in, this space. It's, as I said, we did an autoethnography that ran alongside this. There's so much work going on in this that I didn't tell you about. But at one point, Chris Watling said, is the question that we're really asking ourselves is this as good as it gets? Is it? Have we, is that what we're saying here? We put in all this love and time and effort into feedback and that's it, that's as good as it gets. And I think at the end of the day, the answer to that question and the answer to those 3 questions is no, it isn't as good as it gets. So from that way, it made me feel hopeful. And it also made me feel hopeful that, as part of the project, it's not quite answering those questions. We worked with such wonderful folk. The participants were really so extraordinary, wanting and experimenting and bringing new ways and things. So it was a very hopeful project, and sometimes it was a really sad project because there were points where we saw things that perhaps were less than optimal, not so much sort of reports of, rather than the participants themselves. But I think that, so I feel quite hopeful, and frankly, I'll be frank, I feel a little tired. It's been a long haul and it's a long time, and I need to go away, I think, and do some meaning making of my own.
So I think on that note, since the presenter is tired, we can conclude this seminar. Thanks everyone again for coming along, for people online for sticking with us. This is the last seminar for 2025. Hope to see you all again in 2026. Have a safe and wonderful end of year. And so please join me again in thanking Professor Margaret Beard.